I'm dumbfounded by how many organizations will just select technology without testing. It's like, going to a car dealership and watching the salesperson drive that vehicle around the parking lot and saying, yeah, I want that.
When you properly test drive a solution, you're not just test driving the technology. You're test driving what it's going to be like to work with the people behind the technology.
Are you going to stand up for yourself, or are you going to just get rolled over? And sometimes they're surprised when you stand up for yourself.
We talked about the good, we talked about the bad. Let's get into the ugly.
Welcome to Real Story on MarTech. Ruthless advocates for your MarTech mission. Advising buyers with just the facts on stacks to get you on the right track.
All right, welcome back to the Real Story on MarTech. I'm Jarrod, Gingras, Managing Director of Real Story Group.
And I'm Tony Byrne, the founder of Real Story Group.
All right, Tony, today we're going to be talking about something near and dear to our hearts, and that's MarTech technology platform selection. And today we're going to break it down into the good, the bad, and the ugly about selecting your next technology solution. And over the last 2 decades, as I mentioned, we've been helping hundreds, if not thousands, of enterprises pick their next technology. And I think we've seen it all. If not all, we've seen pretty much close to all, because we've seen many successful technology selections, but we've seen some enterprises really struggle with this. And we get called in at various stages of this project or this process, and we have some lessons that we'd like to share with our listeners today.
Yeah, and one of the things that we're going to do is lead with some examples. You and I certainly have seen a lot of different things go right and go wrong. We're going to have close to a dozen different examples, and I think a lot of you listening, you'll recognize a number of these and maybe assume that, some of this is inevitable, that this is just bound to happen. And I think the argument we're making today is that you don't have to mess this up, that there are good ways of doing this. You can avoid the bad and the ugly and really focus on the good.
Yeah, Tony, and I think we see various statistics all the time from different consulting firms and analyst firms about technology projects being classified as failures, right? And there's a lot of reasons why that could be true, right? A lot can go wrong in implementation, a lot could go wrong in the rollout and change management, when you're introducing new technology to an enterprise. But I don't know about you, but nothing pains me more than seeing a project doomed to fail at the outset because you selected the wrong solution and the wrong partner for what you're trying to do. And that's what we're trying to avoid here.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, selecting the right technology doesn't guarantee you success. It's not sufficient for success, but I think it is almost a necessary precondition. You want to set your team up to be successful and not set them up to fail or to struggle. So let's start with the good, Jarrod, and really start with, what are some things that we've seen out there where this has worked, really well. And so let's dive into kind of 3 topics or 3 commonalities we've seen in the most successful selections. And of course, we have to start with foundationally, making the business case, making a solid business case and doing that first.
Building the business case before you select new technology. That seems like the obvious one and everyone always says, of course you have to do that. Of course we have to do that. But it's shocking to me how many times we get phone calls from people who say, hey, Real Story Group, can you help us build the business case? And when I probe a little bit, I say, all right, well, what stage are you at? How far along are you in your process? And the answer sometimes is, well, we rolled this out a few years ago. We already did the selection. We already did the implementation. We already did the rollout. And now management is asking questions. They're starting to say, why did we make this decision? Why did we do this again? Why did we invest all this money? What kind of ROI are we going to see? And that's really painful when you get to that point when you don't have the case documented.
Yeah, and of course it's sometimes it's about ROI. Sometimes a new selection, a new platform can be just a cost of doing business. There's a lot of different ways to build a business case, but you really want that business case because that's the only way that you can align your stakeholder and narrow your vendor options, and amid all the plethora of different options that you have, help you figure out what really matters. The interesting thing about this is under our methodology, we also use our business objectives as selection criteria. So, we don't do things like, integrate with our CRM as a selection criteria. Not that that's unimportant, it's very important, but what you really want to do, what you're really trying to do is facilitate a smooth handoff maybe from marketing to sales, right? That's the business objective that you have, and underlying that is some sort of business case. So that's really the first good thing. And we've seen many organizations do this very intelligently, some using a lot of math, some using more qualitative. We could debate about that, but clearly, making the business case first and an essential precondition, that's one of the good things that you can do.
Yeah, and one piece of advice, you mentioned the math of it all, and I see many organizations get bogged down in the math, right? And, I don't want to minimize it. It is important, but don't get bogged down in the numbers and the ROI story. Just putting down on paper what you're trying to do, is so useful, right? You might live this world and it might seem super obvious to you, but your colleague across the hall or in another region, they might have some inkling about what this new technology can solve, but before they actually put it on paper and get everyone moving in the right direction, it's impossible to do without stating the case and talking about the benefits that you're going to achieve for the enterprise, not just you individually. So let's move on next to the second commonality we see in successful selections, and that's properly test driving the solution before you buy. In a proper selection process, I think there's some critical test points. The most notable is proper vendor demos, where you have the vendors come in and showcase what their solution is to the challenges that you put before them, but properly test driving that in a way that you're not just leaving the vendor to their own devices and showing you the same canned demo they give everyone else, making the vendors come in and show them their solution as it relates to your challenges, your business case, your business objectives. That's a key critical point in this process. And then further along, the second critical test case is before you make your final decision, we always recommend doing a proof of concept, and in the best of case, do a competitive proof of concept. So competitive proof of concept with your final two in a head-to-head bake-off, if you will, to truly suss out who is the best fit from a vendor and a technology perspective.
Yeah, I'm dumbfounded by how many organizations will just select technology without testing. It's like, going to a car dealership and watching the salesperson drive that vehicle around the parking lot and saying, yeah, I want that. Now you've got to get behind the wheel. And a couple of good examples of this. One was a major global media company that was selecting a new web content management system. So this is really critical for them because content is their product, right? And it was done really intelligently. The business objectives were laid out up front, just like we recommended. But the technology team had a lot of really important questions about scalability, about global distribution, about a number of things. And they didn't want to go into the implementation with these questions open, so they just kept testing. And then sometimes those tests ended up with more questions, and they kept testing. The vendor got a little frustrated, but they were able to work it out, bring some money to the table, and they got all the important questions answered before they signed the contract. And that boded so much more successfully for, first of all, successful implementation, a much faster path to MVP, a much more cooperative environment between the IT and the business and editorial teams. The other thing that just happened last year, we were working with a global hospitality company. They were selecting a customer data platform, or CDP, and they selected through a competitive bake-off like you recommended. Then while they were negotiating the contract, they did a deeper POC with some integration testing, and that was really interesting because they uncovered a hiccup in the platform that was going to be quite expensive for them in the implementation phase, and they were able to negotiate into the contract that the vendor was going to cover, some of those costs. So definitely, it really helps you both in terms of the initial implementation, certainly in de-risking the selection process, but also sometimes inking the right kind of contract.
Yeah, and this might sound a little bit funny coming from the technology analysts in the room, but when you properly test drive a solution, you're not just test driving the technology. You're test driving what it's going to be like to work with the people behind the technology, or, from a professional services team, from a customer support team, from a systems integrator or third party that you might be bringing to the table. Testing them all in a blended way, can really shine a light on what's to come when you engage in a real implementation project. So mimic an implementation project as much as you can in the course of vendor demos, and a proper proof of concept will give you the confidence to go into a real project with your eyes open.
Yeah, and Jarrod, what's interesting about this is it's so much easier today than 10 or 20 years ago because of the proliferation of software as a service or SaaS solutions that, a vendor should be able to set up a custom sandbox for you. A vendor should be able to generate a whole swath of dummy data, dummy content. Any vendor that says they're not going to do that, you really have to question, working with them. So you can simulate a lot of things very, very closely to what real life will be. And the better the simulation, the better the decisions you're going to make.
All right, let's talk about the third commonality of the most successful selections that we've seen, and that's using an agile methodology. Now, I want to be clear here. This is agile with a small a, not agile with a capital A, as it relates to, the project management methodologies and software project methodologies that we all know and love and is probably very prevalent in our organizations. But we're talking about agile in the truest sense of the word, being malleable and not rigid in a prescribed process. And Tony, I think recently we've been both involved with some projects that this agile methodology with a small a really paid some dividends.
Yeah, and you have to kind of start from a point of humility, Jarrod, that you can develop the best requirements and the best test cases, and particularly if it's something new for the enterprise, it's going to be imperfect, or you might be wrong about some things, or more commonly, there's some things you just didn't realize. Like we're working with an insurance company right now, and we're working through some piece of their MarTech stack. They're going in and selecting technologies. And one of the things that they discovered during the demo phase was that marketing analytics was a lot more important to them than they first realized, and that they had kind of underweighted it in the selection. And so now when we're going from the demo into the bake-off, we're adapting a little bit. And we, because it's an iterative process, it gives us a chance to do that. And we're emphasizing marketing analytics a lot more than had we just, had to select from the demo round, it would have been inadequate. So it allows everybody to really learn about what's important, but most importantly, you, the enterprise customer, get a chance to adapt as you learn what's really important for you.
Yeah, I always tell my clients, like, when you start a selection process, you do not have to design the system day one, right? You have to be open to changing along the way, to learning along the way, because you're going to learn a lot throughout this process if we do it right. You're going to learn about what's even possible that you might not be aware of. You're going to learn about, again, as you said, what's most important in your enterprise, for you and your colleagues throughout this process. So that's going to change. Don't design the system day one. There's plenty of time for that down the road.
Yeah. And so sometimes, we use the expression, this is really about design thinking. So if the word agile isn't a good word in your environment, just say, look, this is a more design thinking oriented approach where you kind of conceive of the end first and then work backwards from there. So that's the good three examples, hopefully that I think a lot of you can really grip onto and get a hold of and do going forward. Now let's talk, Jarrod, about the bad. So we've got 4 common pitfalls here that many of you may recognize, and you don't have to take as inevitable. These are things that you can and should avoid.
Yeah, the first one is falling into the trap of building out a requirement spreadsheet and making that the way you communicate your challenges and your problems to the vendors. So if anyone's ever been put on a technology selection team, I bet this rings true to you. What you typically do first, you have a business analyst go around and say, hey, we're buying a new technology. What are your requirements? And what happens is you give that business analyst your 10 requirements. The person sitting next to you gives their 10 requirements. The person in Asia gives their 10 requirements. The person in Europe gives their 10 requirements. And at the end of the day, that spreadsheet becomes this behemoth of a bunch of requirements completely disconnected from each other and not really telling a story of what it is you're trying to do. And as a stakeholder in the process, all you care about is your 10 requirements. And you're not really seeing the big picture. And what we've seen too is, when vendors say they get a checklist-based requirement spreadsheet as part of an RFP, it's hard for them to even figure out what it is that you're trying to buy.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we call this sort of happiness as a set of warm binders, this idea that you can just take everything and develop these complex matrices and so forth. So we were working with a large entertainment company that was going to get a new email service provider. They needed a new email service provider globally. And they did just what you said, and they did an initial RFI, and they sent out a 300-row Excel spreadsheet to have these vendors fill in. And of the 300, probably 200 or 250 were must-have,
Sure.
And the vendors, gamely filled it all out. The customer brought it all back, and it didn't really help them. They looked at it all and said, well, what did we learn? And the answer was actually very little, and they came to us, and we suggested a much more use case oriented approach with a business case behind it, and so on and so forth. But they had spent a lot of time doing this. Now, some of the things that they were getting at were useful from a requirements standpoint. But the other problem with these sorts of checklists is that they end up sort of asking what questions, and what do you do, or do you integrate with Snowflake, do you? And the vendors always say yes, yes, yes. What you really want to do to supplement your use cases and your test cases, which again is the much more human way to do this, but sometimes you do have to have a short checklist of questions, is you ask how. How do you integrate with Snowflake? You get a much more intelligent answer out of that.
Yeah, and let's be honest, we've seen it time and time again. What really happens when you send out these checklist-based RFPs is that the vendor gets it, they send it to their most junior person on staff to then cut and paste from the last time they filled this out from a previous RFP request. It happens time and time and time again. It's just this waste of time for you, waste of time for them, waste of time for everyone. It's not meaningful responses. It's just this exercise that keeps getting churned and churned and churned over and over again. The next pitfall that we want to call out, and is one that we kind of alluded to in the previous section as well, is only viewing canned demonstrations from vendors. We talked about the criticality of that demo week, but I've seen so many demos that are just, again, a waste of time, because all you're seeing is the same canned demo that they gave the person the hour before, or the day before, or the week before, or the month before. It's the same canned demo that highlights their latest innovations and their latest rollouts, their latest product releases, their latest AI functionality, which is all well and good, but does it really get at the crux of what you're trying to do? Does it really hit the blocking and tackling of what's going to impact you and your colleagues on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so here again, we were working with a large university client, and they had been on what we call the demo hamster wheel. So they were looking at some new web content management technology, and maybe they wanted some stuff with it. I mean, partly they had some issues around the scope of it. Would it include DAM? Would it include email? So forth. So they just kept going back to the same vendors and asking for more demos, doing this. And at the end of it, they had seen, four or five vendors demo about 16 times. And at the end of it, they didn't know what to make of it. They thought that this was all going to educate them, and it did educate them to some extent, but it really didn't help them in a very in a way that would actually filter to in a logical way, in a useful business-centric way, to where they had to go. So we had to back them up. Build test cases, select the vendors, and then have the vendors actually demo their use cases across a panoply of key business test cases, but it was highly structured.
So the key there with any kind of demo week is you got to make it real, right? Don't leave the vendors to their own devices. Make them jump through some hoops. Make them demonstrate your scenarios that you spelled out is what you're trying to do. Use your content where appropriate. Use your data where appropriate. Use your real environments and your actors to simulate these tasks. And so it might be a little bit more work on your end up front to give the vendor those stories and some of that content and data to make it real, but good use of your time to put that in place, but to get this.
Yeah. So I think what you're getting at, Jarrod, is there is a little bit of work involved on your behalf.
Yeah.
This is often where we step in and help out with some of that work. But because does require some level of thinking and level of effort, I think it sometimes brings us to the kind of third example of something bad here, which is defaulting to an incumbent vendor just because they're kind of lying around. And the example that I give, or the analogy, is you may have some marketing people who let's say every day they have to effectively drill a small hole through a small piece of wood. And this is what they have to do every morning at 9 a.m. And somebody in the organization pops up and says, hey, I have this big drill press. You could you could bring this to your desk and put in a really small drill bit, and then voila, it works. And the marketing people are looking at this like, oh my God, there's no way, but companies have tools lying around, and the incumbent vendors are going to say, hey, are going to be telling you and your boss and your other boss, your boss's boss, hey, your company's going out and licensing new software when really they should just be using ours. So, it doesn't mean necessarily a bad thing to do, but you shouldn't default to an incumbent just because you have them lying around.
Right, and I see this all the time in the digital asset management world. We get asked to come in and help people pick their damn technology with them, and the business is very gung-ho to get a new damn system in place. They go to their IT department as the first step, and the IT department says, whoa, you don't need a new damn system. We already have SharePoint. We already have Box. We already have Dropbox. One of those things invariably comes up and says, oh, you're just looking for file management, when that's not what digital asset management really does. A true DAM system offers so much more than just file management. But through the eyes of IT, it's saying, oh, we can manage files through a lifecycle. No problem. We already have that. And that's dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's IT, sometimes it's another business unit. And here again, you've got to have your business case in place here, because there's always, just out of wanting to reduce complexity or sometimes just complacency, there's always this incentive to say, wouldn't our lives be that much easier? Wouldn't, essentially, we're kind of taking the decision out of our hands and putting it into a vendor's hand, and that's always tempting. But I would say more often than not, it's not the right solution and doesn't solve the business problem. And so it becomes a missed opportunity.
All right, next up, let's talk about this notion of that, or this challenge that we see all the time, where selection teams think that all the stakeholders on that team have an equal voice at the party, and I think what we've learned over the years is that not all stakeholders are created equal.
That's right. Not all stakeholders are created equal, and not all teams are created equal. So I think that if I was going to summarize the fourth pitfall that we see here, it's letting one group or one person decide as opposed to an integrated team.
Yeah, and the classic example here is like business goes off and selects a product without IT's involvement, or IT goes off and selects it without business's involvement. Happens all the time, hopefully less and less these days. But I think maybe even more prevalent is a situation where it's a bit nuanced than just business versus IT. It's more like there's a person or a group of people who have a larger voice than some of the other people in the room. I can think of an example where we went through an entire selection process and did everything right. Went through the demos, as we talked about, that important demo phase, and the team really liked the third demo of the four that we saw, but the CMO couldn't make it to that demo. She went to all the other three, but she didn't. She missed the one that the entire team had as their favorite. And so this caused some real challenges, because in the CMO's mind, that was not her favorite. She didn't. It was still a black box to her, and that kind of derailed the whole process. So just one example of how not all stakeholders are equal.
Yeah, and before we close out on this, though, sometimes it can be the opposite, though, as well. I think we've both been in the room where there's like north of 60, 80, 100 people, and they're trying to vote on this. And it's like, okay, that's probably too many cooks in the kitchen. You want to find that balance. But I think the important thing that you mentioned was this notion of an integrated cross-functional team, ideally with a business lead, but making sure that all the key non-business stakeholders, which can be, certainly legal, compliance, various parts of IT, product teams, sometimes sales leadership or other kind of adjacent parties where it's really critical to get everyone on board. The makeup of that team can vary, but the key thing is to get the right stakeholders with a business lead and trying to come to the best decision for the enterprise.
Yeah, and I'll add one more group of people that should be involved in the process throughout, if not at the very outset, and that's procurement. Your procurement team is going to have a loud voice here. Now, I've seen many situations where the business likes to, butt heads with procurement, but if you involve them early, in our experience, it's a much easier process. They really, the process that we outline sometimes, this design thinking methodology, might not always be top of mind for the traditional procurement folks, but when they dig into it, they do like it because it is all about reducing risk, which is what they're there to provide as well. All right, Tony, now let's get into maybe the most fun-ish type topic. We talked about the good, we talked about the bad. Let's get into the ugly. And I think we have 4 what we're calling worst-case scenarios.
Yeah, so the first one that we see a lot is kind of blind love or love at first sight. And we know that sometimes in the real world, love at first sight, certainly in a lot of novels that you read, works out in the end. In the real world, love at first sight or blind love doesn't usually lead to a good long-term relationship.
Yeah, and where I see this happening most often is when you go to a conference and, you go into the vendor room where there's booths all lining the outside of the big conference room with the meal in the middle, and the attendees of that conference signed up for this conference because they have a challenge, right? And when they start to go see the demos at the booths there, they're saying, "Oh my gosh, I could just pick any of these and it's way better than what we have at home." And it's very easy to just fall in love with the latest and greatest technology that you see, at a conference, on a webinar, in a demo. And so we see people falling in love with the possibilities of the technology. We also see people get swayed by a vendor's rep or salesperson. It might be the first person you meet at this conference, or, they're the person that you saw the demo from and you really like them. You think that this person, he or she, jives with your team, and that's all well and good as a start, but that's not who the person that you're going to be working with long term. So don't fall in love with the salesperson alone.
Yeah, and it's okay to get excited about technology. There's a lot of exciting stuff happening in the MarTech world, but you never want to skip a rigorous selection methodology. And sometimes what we see when an individual or a team kind of falls in love with a vendor or a particular platform is that, like in the real world, when you fall in love, they ignore some key red flags, or they just rule out the possibility that there might be a better overall fit. So you always want to test these things. And of course, what you're fighting against too is that you have vendors who say we're unique in the marketplace, we're the only ones, or we're the leading one, And the example I use is like, we're the only purple parrot, It's like, but dude, you're still a parrot, and there's all kind of other parrots, and what we really need is a parrot and not necessarily a purple parrot, right? And so all vendors have competitors, and the key thing is just to find them and test them head to head.
Yeah. The next kind of worst case scenario is something that really frustrates the both of us, I know, and that's when we see our clients shortlisting the wrong vendors. This is something that is really painful and can lead you astray really quickly.
Yeah, this can get really ugly really fast, because shortlisting is so critical. On the one hand, you don't want to be looking deeply at 12 vendors. On the other hand, you don't want to be just looking deeply at 2 vendors. So what's the right set in between? There's an art and a science to this. And so we'll see sometimes companies will come to us already having made a short list, and we're just kind of dumbfounded by what we see. We see this a lot in industries like digital asset management, like CDP, certainly like web content management, where it's on kind of a complexity spectrum. And so we'll see, again, to use the automotive analogy, saw one firm, a big manufacturing company, who came to us and said, yeah, we've already looked at the market. We're basically, and here's our short list. There's 5 vendors. And I'm looking at it and like, okay, you've got one Ferrari, one Lexus, a Honda Accord, a used Malibu, and a kit car you're going to build yourself. And somehow we're going to compare all these and do test drives. It's like, I can tell you the Ferrari is going to win, but you don't realize that it's going to spend half the time in the shop, and you're going to end up paying, an incredible total cost of ownership. So let's step back for a second here and get to the short list, the right way.
Yeah, I'm going to mix metaphors here a little bit, but the best short lists are the ones that you're comparing apples to apples to apples, right? And to your point, I see a lot of short lists that have apples to oranges to dump trucks, and that's a problem. But the reason it's a major problem in my mind is, like, if you're really committing to doing this right, you're going through a process where that's going to take time, and you're going to have that blended team of resources that costs money and expensive resources, lots of time. You don't want to be wasting their time or your company's time in the selection process on unnecessary rabbit holes, and that's what happens when you have the wrong vendors on the list here. You have to manage these vendors. You have to sit in these demos. That's expensive, and so let's make the best use of your time, your team's time, and make sure you're comparing those apples to apples to apples.
Yeah, totally. And of course, we're a little bit biased here because we do vendor research, and we publish our own what we call dynamic real quadrants that are based on your actual inputs and your specific needs. But the getting to the right shortlist, it's partly an art, but it really also can be a kind of a science here, where this becomes a conversation. But you definitely want to do the shortlist only after you've developed your requirements. So
yeah, and I'm sure we'll talk about this in some future episodes. But one of the big reasons is that we see mismatched shortlist is we see people going and looking at various analyst outputs, quadrants and whatnot, and looking to the upper rights of these quadrants and saying, hey, if it's in the upper right, maybe those should be on my short list, when those vendors oftentimes are fundamental mismatches for your organization. And again, as we mentioned earlier, sometimes this might take a little bit more work on your part in the outset. Don't just take the easy route and look at the upper right. You have to do some digging, find out which vendors were truly built to solve your use cases and your business objectives. And that's where your homework is going to pay off immensely going forward. Tony, next I wanted to call back to a previous episode that we did, and that's around the ugliness that we see when vendors start to bully their prospective clients.
Yeah, so, Jarrod, we can point people back to that previous episode, but where this happens in the selection process is going to be more like, okay, I see you have a process, but we're going to do it using our process. And certainly some of the bigger MarTech vendors, I won't name names, but one of them starts with the letter A and the other starts with the letter S. They're like, well, we're gonna do this our way. So you may set up a test-based selection process, and they then come back and say, well, we're gonna test this our way, or we're just gonna throw a bunch of screenshots and PowerPoints and industry experts at you, rather than actually testing the solution. And they'll push hard. They'll push hard with your leadership, and you really need to stand up for owning your process. You're going to be the one paying the bill. You're going to be the one at some level owning this platform. You have to stand up for your process.
And maybe some of the ugliest situations that I've seen is when we get to the vendor demo stage and the vendor presenting that day doesn't follow the rules, and comes in and says, oh, we appreciate those scenarios that you wrote and put in that RFP, but we're just going to demo, or show you our PowerPoint in worst case scenario instead of the demo, or we're just going to give that same demo. And, when we've been in the room, we've had to shut these things down sometimes and say, hey, no, if you want to, don't waste our time with that stuff. We want to see the scenarios in this order so that our team can compare apples to apples to apples again. And it can get ugly, but again, it's all about not wasting anyone's time.
Yeah, and really what you're doing here in your interactions with any vendor from day one, whether it's an incumbent or a new vendor, is you're kind of setting the terms of the relationship. What is this going to be like? Are you going to stand up for yourself, or are you going to just get rolled over? And sometimes they're surprised when you stand up for yourself, and because they're used to sometimes rolling over their clients. But in a very real way, there's the written contract, and then there's the unwritten contract, and you're writing the unwritten contract of your relationship with the vendor from the first day that you start interacting with them. So you need to keep that in mind and say, okay, it's not that you're closed-minded around creative ways of exploring things, but you have a certain number of test-based, scenario-based steps that you want to go through. All the other vendors are going through it, so you, big vendor A, B, C, D, also need to go through it, or we're simply not considering that. So anyway, speaking of contracts, that takes us to our fourth kind of ugly, common set of ugliness here, which is waiting too late in the process to negotiate the terms and the pricing. So
yeah, I think in an agile methodology, that negotiation starts day one of your vendor communication, right? Don't wait till the end of this process, because there are savvy salespeople behind these technologies. No matter what size of the vendor, from the biggest vendors out there to the smallest, there are savvy salespeople behind this technology that know when they have an advantage, right? And so we see it time and time again where you get these questions around, oh, so who else are we competing against? Or, are we down to the finalists? Have we been named a finalist? Is there another one of our competitors that's still in the mix? And they're always trying to probe these questions. And you can just respond nicely and say, hey, as part of our process, we're declining to reveal that information. And some people don't feel like they can say no to those questions, but you can. And I think it's all about keeping the advantage on your side of the court here, because if you wait till the end, the vendors will know that you've invested all of this money to get to the end, and that they're a leader. They're going to be less likely to back off some of their demands, and because they know they have an advantage in that case.
That's right. You lose all your leverage by delaying your negotiation. So a lot of this is, what kind of bandwidth do you have on your partner's behalf? And I'll talk about that in a second. But your vendors, you're learning about the vendor, but they're also kind of learning about you, and they're experts in this, and you may not be. So to circle back to an earlier point you made, Jarrod, is ideally you bring in your sourcing and procurement team early into the process, but it's also your job as a business team to really push the vendor hard on their pricing. Make sure you totally understand it, scour it, play with it, ask them for different scenarios, different pricing. They may huff and puff, doesn't matter. Push them. Really set up your negotiation team for success. Try to get as low a price as possible, then turn it over to your sourcing and procurement allies, who hopefully and usually are very good at that, making sure that you're getting, the best possible deal. But the way to do that is to start negotiating early and often.
Yeah, and remember, this is a learning exercise, not just for you, but for the vendors as well, right? So as you go through this agile, iterative process, they're learning more and more about what makes you tick and your culture and your big needs. So if that's the case, their pricing should get better, right? Ultimately, you're all moving in that same direction. You should be getting closer and closer to a deal. All right, Tony, that's the good, the bad, and the ugly. And as always, we want to remind everyone to avoid the ugly where possible, minimize the bad, and strive for the good. That's the goal here.
Yeah, and if there's one, we had, I guess, about 12 different examples here. But if I want to just leave you with the most actionable tip, and that is to always start with your business objectives and have that drive everything. Have that drive all of your decisions, including even, your technical vetting. So, of course, As a former tech lead, I'm not going to say the technology is unimportant. Sometimes architectures are really critical here, but it's all towards what are your business goals. And if those are really clear for everyone on the team, that becomes your Rosetta Stone for focusing on the good, minimizing the bad, and certainly avoiding the ugly.
Yeah. And if anyone is interested in diving deeper on any of these topics, a few years ago, you and I were approached by our friends at Rosenfeld Media to actually codify our process, because what they were seeing from their readership is that many people were just struggling with this. So we wrote this book called The Right Way to Select Technology. And I think it's been a really useful guide for a lot of teams out there. And, and if anyone's interested in that, go to Rosenfeld Media and check it out there, or shoot us an email. We'll tell you how to get a copy. All right, Tony, next week, we're going to be hitting on a topic that we're eminently qualified to talk about, I think, and that's why industry analysts suck.
Yeah, so this is, at first blush, kind of a strange one because, of course, you and I are industry analysts, and it's pretty rare to have a couple people saying why their industry is absolutely awful, but the reality is our industry is absolutely awful when it comes to empowering and enabling and supporting enterprise MarTech leaders like you, the folks listening in here. And so we're going to describe exactly why that is and what you can do about it.
Can't wait. It's going to be fun. So as always, thank you all so much for listening today. We would ask anyone who wants to get more information, visit realstorygroup.com. In addition, I'd invite anyone to subscribe to this podcast on whatever channel you're interacting with us today. Thank you all so much for being here today. Tony, thanks. Have a good day.